Rez Dogs, chapters 11 through 15. Chapter 11, Sergeant Ed. "Hello, the house," a voice called from outside. Malian, who had been trying to figure out what to do about the assignment she'd just been given to write an essay for her teacher, welcomed the interruption because she was feeling totally stuck about finding a topic. She opened the door and looked out. A tall man wearing a mask was standing next to the mailbox. Despite the mask, Malian knew just who he was. There was only one person at Pennacook who was 6'10" and drove a tribal police car. It had to be Sergeant Ed. Despite the mask, Malian knew there was a smile on the broad face of the former Indian League Star Center. Sergeant Ed was always smiling, and everyone on the res liked him. It seemed that everyone included dogs. To Malian's surprise, Malcolm was sitting next to the tall tribal cop and letting him scratch his neck. Sergeant Ed straightened and held up his cell phone. "Call me," he said in a loud voice. "You got me on your contacts, right? Been trying to reach you today." Malian looked at her phone. 3 missed calls. She'd forgotten to turn the ringer back on. She hit the number to reply. "Hey," the voice of Sergeant Ed said in phony surprise. "Who is this?" Malian laughed. She could see why people loved the way Sergeant Ed deployed his sense of humor first in just about any situation. "We're fine," she said. "Is anything wrong?" Sergeant Ed grinned. "Just checking up on a report about some fierce dog been hanging around here. Apparently not this one." He reached down and scratched behind Malcolm's ears. "You're a real teddy bear, aren't you, boy?" Malcolm dropped down and rolled over onto his back, prompting the sergeant to lower himself to one knee to rub the big dog's chest. "Got this complaint from the state health service lady, which is not unusual. She's always complaining about us Pennacooks." Sergeant Ed shrugged as he continued to run his hands over Malcolm's belly. "So where did you get this guy from?" "He just sort of showed up," Malian said. Sergeant Ed nodded. "You know," he said, "them 2 white spots over his eyes make him what in the old days we call a 4-eyed dog, sort of a medicine animal." Malian smiled, but didn't tell the sergeant she'd already heard about a dog like that from her grandfather. "My great-grandma," the sergeant continued, "told me a story about a dog like that. Wish I could remember it. But you know, I bet your grandmother remembers. She is one of the best storytellers around here. As well as about the best fry bread maker, next to my Aunt Gertrude, of course. You ought to ask her about that 4-eyed dog story." "I will," Malian replied. "Okay then," Sergeant Ed said. "Seeing as how everything is all good here, I guess my job is done. You have a real good day. And you and my friend here, you both take care of your grandparents." The tall sergeant climbed into his police car and leaned out the window. "If that real fierce dog ever shows up here again, you give me a call, okay?" "Okay," Malian agreed, trying not to laugh. "Good, now I got to skedaddle. Left Stanley alone on the roadblock. Want to make sure he's not getting any more trouble from the stadies, trying to tell us we cannot stop and turn back every single car that's not from here, trying to take the shortcut through our reservation. I just told them state patrolmen, oh yes we can, especially with this pandemic. Then I just grinned down at them and made 'em wait till we got our tribal lawyer there." Sergeant Ed chuckled, who pointed out it's there in the treaty we got the right to enforce traffic on any road goes through our reservation. As Sergeant Ed drove away, Malcolm rolled over, sat up, turned, and looked at Malian, his mouth open in a wide doggy grin. "My golly," Malian said, "you are one smart dog, aren't you?" Malcolm nodded his head. Chapter 12, Been There. The weather had finally broken. The sun was shining down like a smiling face. Malian and Grandpa Roy were spading up the garden behind the house. They'd both been watching on her iPad a story on the CNN news feed about the protests going on around the country, people standing up for racial justice. "About time," her grandfather had said. "Let's keep those folks in our thoughts. Seems to me right now that's the best we can do, seeing as how we can't be with them." Then he'd stood up. "And seeing as how the garden won't spade up itself, seems to me like it's time to go outside. Ready to go?" "You bet," she'd replied. Malcolm was sitting at the garden edge close to where Malian was working. When they'd started spading, he'd come over to them and begun to dig with his front paws. "Go for it, boy," Grandpa Roy had said. "Save us the trouble." But all Malcolm did was make a shallow hole where he could sit in the cool earth, settle back, and watch. Grandma Frances was inside making pies using some of the rhubarb they'd just picked from the patch to the side of the garden. Within a few days, they would also be harvesting asparagus from the bed her grandfather had made more than 50 years ago. Small white spears were starting to poke up from the ground, rich with mulch. Her grandparents' garden was not a big one, only 30 feet long and 12 feet wide, but more than enough to grow all the corn and beans and squash they would need. Plus, they had lettuce and radishes already planted at the edge of the garden when it was still not yet warm enough for most other things. And on the other side of the garden, in a separate bed, her grandfather had finally put in his beloved potatoes. If we could still go out like we did in the old days, gathering medicine from the woods and fish from the streams, there'd be no need to go to any grocery store, Grandma Frances always said. Her grandfather stopped and looked over at her and the big dog. "Sure a lot to be thankful for today, isn't it?" he said. Malcolm woofed his agreement as Malian nodded. "I guess you could say we're a lot like Note Kikad," she said, bringing a smile to her grandfather's face. "You know," he said, "seems like you remember stories as well as your father always did." Malian shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "I just wish I could find one that would fit in with the assignment I have to do now, the new one for my language arts course." "What sort of story are you looking for?" "Well," she said, "we're supposed to write something that has to do with everything that's going on right now, but I'm not even sure where to start. Nothing like this has ever happened before." Grandpa Roy shook his head. "That's what some might say, but not us. In a way, we've been through this all before." Malian put down her spading fork. She sat on one of the cedar stumps her grandfather had placed around the garden to use as stools or tables or whatever they might be handy for. The best way to ask for a story was just to be ready and listen. Her grandfather sat down on the stump next to hers. "They ever talk in your school about how many people were here before Columbus?" Malian nodded. "Most of the books say maybe 2 or 3 million. Grandpa Roy nodded back. "Yep, that's what they say." He paused, took out his big red handkerchief, and wiped his brow. "But I've done a lot of reading and research over the years, and I've listened to what the elders told. And I'd say that just here in what they called the United States, there were at least 20 times that many. When those new people came, they brought with them all kinds of germs. Measles, whooping cough, influenza, smallpox, all sorts of diseases that we never had any names for. By the time those pilgrims landed on the coast to the east of here, all that they found was empty land because our people there had died or run to get away from all that sickness." Grandpa Roy shook his head, then he grinned. "Maybe what you ought to write is just been there, done that." Chapter 13, The Assignment. It was a week after Malian had told her 8th grade teacher the things her grandparents had shared with her about how the Indian Health Service had made it so Indian women could not have any more children. Miss Mendelson had not believed her at first, until the two of them did an internet search. "I am so sorry," Miss Mendelson had said. It had made the two of them closer, especially when Malian pointed out to her what she'd just found on the internet about something called the Eugenics Project in the nearby state of Vermont. It had been set up to sterilize what they called unfit people, a lot of them Native men and women, back in the 1930s. The scientists of Nazi Germany had based some of their ideas on what was done in Vermont. That was when Miss Mendelson shared with Malian that her own Jewish grandmother was a Holocaust survivor who'd been in a concentration camp. Malian thought about that as she clicked on the link to the class Zoom meeting, thought about the way so many things tied into each other. Her face blurring from the poor connection, Miss Mendelson appeared on the screen. "I know what your final assignment is going to be," she said. I've been thinking a lot about everything that is happening in the world now. Some of the things you've all shared with me in our conversations or handed in, like Malian's short essay that reminded us how Native American people were so affected by other diseases long before this pandemic, made me start thinking differently. Then she paused, her face looking troubled. I remembered something that happened to me. It's made me realize that we need to hear more of each other's stories. Malian could tell something was really bothering her. I am going to start by telling you a story of my own. It won't be long, but it will tell you something about me, something I did not realize, something I now need to share. It's about something that happened. It happened before the virus came, before the protests, before everything that's so confusing today. She paused, took a breath, then went on. I've never shared this story before, not with anyone, but now is the time. As you all know, I used to take the city bus from my home to school. Even though it was a cold day and everyone was all bundled up, it was sunny and beautiful, and so I got off 2 blocks early to walk across the park. But as I started walking, I got this feeling that someone was following me. I looked back quickly, and I could see a tall figure wearing a hoodie. He was too far away to make out his features, but I guessed he was black. I started to walk faster then, and so did he, catching up on me. No one else was around. I felt so afraid. I reached into my pocket just in case I had to dial 911. But when I couldn't find my phone, I panicked and I started to run. Behind me, that person began to run too. That was when I slipped and fell down. I stayed on the ground, unable to move. I thought for sure I was going to be hurt, but then I heard a familiar voice. Teacher? Mrs. Mendelson, are you okay? When I looked up, I saw a hand holding out my cell phone to me. Here, you dropped this on the bus. It was one of my students from 2 years ago, a boy who's in high school now. He helped me up, and I said thank you. But I never told him how afraid I'd been. I never told him what it taught me that day. Even though I thought I wasn't racist, something in me was still afraid of people with skin color different from mine. Miss Mendelson's face on Malian's iPad disappeared as the connection faltered. Only a second passed, but when the image resolved itself again, her teacher's eyes looked wet. I never apologized to Rodney for what I was thinking, Miss Mendelson said, but now I'm apologizing to all of you for not being a better teacher. She paused again, took a sip of water from the bottle on top of her desk. I think that what we all need now is to know each other better. That's why I'm asking you to share whatever it is you want us to know about you and your family. You can tell your story however you want, long or just a few paragraphs. Read it aloud, put it up on the screen, play music behind it, that's all fine. If you'd like, include some images, even make a movie if you want. That all would be fine, it's up to you. But let's use this chance to get to know each other better. That way, maybe something good can come out of this hard year. That is what I hope. Miss Mendelson swallowed hard. Is this assignment clear enough? Is it something you'd all like to do? Send me a yes, a thumbs up, or whatever to let me know how you feel. Right away, the messages began coming one after another in the chat box. Yeses, thumbs up, hearts, and even a few emojis of smiling faces. When the final one came up, Miss Mendelson nodded her head. Okay, she said, we're all agreed. Now, in case anyone hasn't noticed, with all of our days being the same, today is Friday. She smiled at her joke. So this is your weekend assignment. Next Monday, bright and early at 10, we can start hearing from everyone. Meanwhile, take care of yourselves and please be kind to each other. She lifted her hand to touch her screen and then was gone. A voice spoke from over Malian's shoulder. Want your grandma and me to help some with that assignment of yours? Malian spun her chair around and wrapped her arms around her grandfather. More than anything. Chapter 14, Malian's story. Malian had asked to be the last one to do her presentation. "Are you sure you won't be nervous?" her teacher had asked. "No," she'd said. "Waiting is something you get used to when you're Native American." Her teacher had started to laugh, then caught herself. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't mean to make light of your people's history." "It's okay to laugh," Malian said. "That was a joke, sort of." Of the 20 kids in her class, only 15 were able to get online for their presentation. Each one was just 10 minutes long with a 2-minute break in between. Malian was glad she was last. It made it easier for her to really listen to what each of her classmates had to share. She found herself learning things about them she'd never known before. Some had families that had been in Boston for generations, though none of the others were Native Americans. But no one had a genealogy longer than Francine Wu. Her family had moved to the city from San Francisco 5 years ago. She told the story of how her father made a trip to the archives in Beijing to look up their family history. "Can you guess how far back he was able to trace it?" she asked everyone. 2010 years. But, she said, the records only listed the male heads of the families and what scores they had on their examinations. Then she told the story about her ancestor, who was a famous admiral. He had sailed his ships all around the world and came to North America years before Columbus. Finally, it was Malian's turn. She'd thought a lot about what she was going to say. There were so many things her teacher and classmates did not know. But the question was, which things should she share? She didn't want to make people feel bad, but she also wanted to be honest. Should she tell them about the time 2 centuries ago when the colonial government offered bounties for Indian scalps? She had decided not to tell that story. It would be too hard for them to take. She took a deep breath and began to talk. She told them how her own mother was taken from her family and adopted out. She told them about the boarding schools where her grandparents were forbidden to speak their language and were told to be ashamed of their own culture. Those were the old days, not the good old days, she said. And then she smiled. No one should feel guilty about the past unless they're not doing anything about the present. That's what my grandparents say. Think about what we are doing now and how it will affect the world 7 generations from today, and not just in the next election. As she spoke, she heard Malcolm walk up behind her, his nails clacking on the floor. It was the first time he'd ever come into the house. "We have to think," my grandparents say, "about every living thing, about all of our relations." As she spoke those words, behind her the big dog stood up on his hind legs and gently put his front paws on Malian's shoulders. She put her right hand on Malcolm's big paw. "My friend and I," she said, "want to tell you this story. Long ago, the Creator decided it was time to make human beings. The Creator wanted them to be strong, and so they were made out of stone. They were strong for sure. But because their hearts were hard, they crushed everything with their heavy feet. All they cared about was themselves. So the Creator took those first people, broke them up into stones, and put them back on the land. That is why there are so many stones here in our land." Then the Creator looked around and saw the ash trees rooted deep in the land and dancing in the wind, joining their branches together with the other trees around them. So the next human beings were made from the ash trees, and like those ash trees, they were rooted in the ground, and their hearts were always growing. Those trees were my ancestors. Malian paused. It seemed as if she could feel everyone listening to her. "My grandparents say that is what we must do now. Take care of each other and take care of our land. We need to be kind to each other and to all living things. Make the circle strong for those who come after us. Instead of just standing up alone like those first stone people, we need to bend our knees and touch the earth." She heard one of the kids who were listening. "Look at them, her grandparents, even the dog," another kid said. Malian looked back over her shoulder. Behind her, in full view of the camera, Her grandparents had each knelt down on one knee. Malcolm was now sitting in between her grandparents with one front leg bent as if he too was kneeling. Malian felt tears forming in her eyes. "I am going to end it here," she managed to say. "I'm going to do it in our old way. Instead of saying goodbye in English, I'm going to leave you with these words from our old Wabanaki language. Willipamkani Nidobak. Have a good journey, my friends." Chapter 15, Afterward. School had been out for 3 weeks. Summer had come to the Rez. Malian sat on her grandparents' porch, smelling the lilacs that bloomed by the walk. Even though it was too warm for him to place his head in her lap, Malcolm was there right next to her. Malian smiled as she thought of all the things that had happened since she'd found herself unable to leave her grandparents. She felt good about the way she'd been able to help them. And not only that, she felt even more sure about being at Pennacook. "I'm just like you," she said to Malcolm as she leaned over to stroke his head. "I know this place is our home." She looked down the poorly paved road. No sign yet of their car. Now that things seemed to have let up some, people were traveling, at least a little, and the reservation was no longer locked down. Her parents were coming to pick her up. She'd be back home, and that made her glad. But even so, she also wished she could somehow be both places at once. Or maybe have one of those transporters like those in the Star Trek shows her grandpa loved. "But you can come with me," she whispered to Malcolm. "Mom and Dad told me they'd love to have you as their honored guest." The big dog pricked up his ears. He lifted his head and looked down the road. Then he stood up and looked straight into Malian's eyes. "Oh," she said. "Oh." Malcolm nodded, turned, and began to run. He disappeared into the small woods behind the house, just as Malian heard the crunching of tires approaching on the broken road. "His place is here," a soft voice said from behind her. Malian turned to look. Her grandmother was in the doorway, and her grandfather came up next to her. "Don't worry," her grandfather said. "A Rez Dog knows where it needs to be. He'll be here for you for sure when you come back again." "After all," her grandmother said as Malian stood and wrapped her arms around both of them, "just like us, you're a Rez Dog too."